Do you love spy books, movies, and TV? Then the Spybrary podcast is for you.
And then you have this wonderful fight, Connery versus Shaw. There's this physicality that's so believable between the two of them. They're very evenly matched. You know, there's no obvious winner of who's actually going to win that fight. And it's probably the most spectacular Bond fight, I think, in a film. And we've never really had that since.
Hello, everybody. This is Shane Whaley for Spybrary. I'm delighted to tell you we're bringing back Section F. Today we're talking all about From Russia with Love. We are joined by our Section F operatives, Eric Newsom and Michael Huie. Welcome back, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
See you again.
And special guest, Llewella Chapman, who wrote the BFI book, that's the British Film Institute book, on From Russia with Love. So something tells me she might just be a fan of the movie. How are you, Llewella?
Very well, thank you. And thank you ever so much to you, Michael and Eric, for inviting me along today.
Yes, absolutely. So I wanted to kick off. The first question I had for you all, and Llewella, I'm going to start with you. When was the first time that you remember watching From Russia with Love?
It was actually the second Bond film I saw. The first one was when I was around about 7 years of age, and my dad showed me an off-air VHS copy of Dr. No. And my brother and I really loved that film. So he thought, next weekend, after the supermarket shop, I'll show them From Russia with Love. And what my dad didn't tell me is that there were other novels, there were other films to enjoy for James Bond. And so what was really special for From Russia with Love for me was when I watched the film, I did not know that Bond was going to escape Red Grant. So when I see him in that train carriage on his knees, I actually thought Bond might die because I wasn't then, conditioned to understand what the hero would do in film. So yeah, From Russia with Love is really special to me because it was the only time really in a film that I thought that the hero might actually not survive. And he does, of course. But yeah, it was a great time.
And how about you, Eric? When was the first time you recall watching From Russia with Love?
So I was trying to think here. I'm sure that I saw it during, James Bond movie marathons that would come on when I was a kid that I loved. But I remember it not being one that I gravitated toward as a child. But then I got the, my first purchase of a James Bond box set, my first purchase of many box sets since then. This was on VHS 2 or 3 formats ago, watching it in college and revisiting it there for the first time, really seeing it for the first time and being able to appreciate that this was a different type of James Bond than I loved and that I remembered as a kid. My approach to the film was something a little more mature in terms of the storytelling and understanding how that storytelling came across, through the filmmaker's choices on the screen. And so I would say I'm sure I watched it plenty as a kid, and it didn't register as much as, some of the other big stunt-filled Bond films. But when I watched it in college, it was a revelation for me.
Yeah. And how about you, Michael?
I watched most of the Connery Bonds on here in the U.S. The ABC Sunday night movie was when they showed sort of all the prestige films. And Goldfinger was the first one that I saw. So I saw From Russia with Love at some point there. And to me, it was always the one, when I was a kid, with the incredible fight scene on the Orient Express.
It's interesting. When I was watching it the other day for this, in my mind, I watched it as a child. And for some reason, I always thought it was in black and white, which obviously we know it's not. It's in color. And then I remembered, I think I must have watched it. Our younger viewers won't remember these, but portable black and white televisions, because obviously my mother probably wanted to watch some soap opera or something on the other side than I wanted to watch. So in my head, my first memory of From Russia with Love is that it was black and white. And as a young boy, I didn't really enjoy From Russia with Love. And I was thinking about it the other day, obviously sitting black and white's never great, but I found it quite boring as a kid. And the really interesting about this is when I watched it the other day, I'll say from the outset, I think it's number one in terms of the Bond movies. I really love it now. And it's the same with my reading. I often say on Spybrary that the Kalashnikov Kid books I would have loved in my teens and my early 20s, but now I wouldn't read them. And I think that's the same. Our tastes change. Was that the same for anyone else?
Yeah, so I'll say that's the case for me. And in watching this again recently, it struck me how intelligently the movie treats its audience too. There are a number of, I'm sure we'll talk about a number of places where things happen on screen that aren't sort of directly explained, the importance of those things, or a lot of the interactions, the emotional interactions of the characters are very inherent and not explicit in nature. The ways in which people feel about each other, the ways in which they're trying to decide the motivations of other people are unspoken on the screen. And there's a lot of gleaning to be done, which I think is one of the things that I probably, a lot of, I'm sure, we're talking about a film that centers on a sex tape, right? The center of the SPECTRE operation is they're making a sex tape here. And that shot over my head as a child, I'm sure. And all of the implications of that and all of the implications of the relationship between him and Tatiana. This feels like a much more adult Bond movie than especially some of the later ones when they fall into a more consistent formula.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Eric. I'm assuming, which one should never do, of course, that 99.9% of our listeners and viewers have watched From Russia with Love. But if you haven't, what the heck have you been doing with your life? Secondly, the plot is James Bond willingly falls into an assassination plot involving a naive Russian beauty in order to retrieve a Soviet encryption device that was stolen by the organization SPECTRE. So I think my question is, Llewella, how did you feel From Russia with Love evolves from Dr. No? What are some of the key differences? Because obviously this was the second Bond that was made in 1963. What are some of the key differences, do you think, from Dr. No?
I think, to start with, not that I agree with the director is all powerful and all tear, but Terence Young becomes more confident with what he's doing with Bond. But also, I hate to say this, but for me personally, having revisited Dr. No quite a few times over the last few years, the film starts off as quite police procedural in a British kind of term. And then suddenly gets exciting as soon as Ken Adams' set sort of appears with the tarantula and Dent, and then it all gets very exciting for Dr. No. Whereas the thing with From Russia with Love is it's a very different film. They still haven't worked out the Bond formula quite yet. And what Terence Young and the rest of the crew seem to want to do, and Eon Productions, is to make this this really savvy spy British thriller kind of drama out of it. And of course, it's the last film that Fleming actually goes on to location to watch while it's being filmed. And what they really managed to achieve is something really special, I think, because unlike Goldfinger, which is, of course, the next film, where it becomes more Bond formula and almost quite humorous in the way they're dealing with it, this film has humour, but it's quite dark with what they're trying to achieve. And they don't have Ken Adam to do these spectacular sets, so they're reliant on realism. And I think one of the most, I know we're going to come back to this, but one of the most stunning scenes for me is after Bond leaves the Orient Express and you have Grant just trailing him, just watching him through the window, stalking him, watching and viewing everything about him and his psychology. And that's just fascinating in a film, especially a Bond film. We don't get that anymore, even with the Daniel Craig films. Not that level of, creepiness and psychology that we can really engage with. And, we've spoken about this earlier, but even as a child, I was mesmerized by that. I was really creeped out by that moment. And then you have this wonderful fight. And that's the other thing. We'll come on to actors, I know, but Connery versus Shaw, there's this physicality that's so believable between the two of them. They're very evenly matched. There's no obvious winner of who's actually going to win that fight. And it's probably the most spectacular Bond fight, I think, in a film. And we've never really had that since, you think of what you have with Roger Moore and Jaws. Well, Jaws kind of has the superior, you know, tactic of almost superior, like with his jaws, and he'll go for Roger Moore with his knock knees and whatever. Whereas with Connery and Shaw, they have this genuine physical fight, and you don't know who's going to win. And as a child, I thought that was amazing.
Really good points, Citra. And Michael and Eric, do jump in with your thoughts. I think in terms of Red Grant, you know, you have that wonderful scene with Rosa Klebb when she punches him with a knuckle duster, and you have that build-up. This is a scary villain. This is a guy who can handle himself.
Olivia, really,
George is more comedic.
She really gives it to him in that scene. Like, you know, there's a bit of a flinch there. You see some impact on the stomach. So I'm not sure of the extent to which Shaw is acting to the extent which Shaw is just trying to keep it together from having just got socked in the gut by a pair of brass knuckles. So
you can actually see him clench his abs right before she hits him. So yeah, I mean, I just think you can't say enough about the villains in this movie overall. I mean, certainly Robert Shaw is spectacular. I mean, he's a fantastic actor, and Lana Lenya as well. They both have theater backgrounds. They're both highly respected actors. Lana Lenya has arguably the greatest death scene of any villain in a Bond movie. I mean, she really milks it, which is kind of awesome. But Robert Shaw, yeah, I mean, that fight scene. You know, I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with the OSS 117 parodies, the French movies. They do a great parody of Bond fights, where logic is sort of thrown out. But that fight scene on the Orient Express, I just rewatched it this morning, is so intense, and it just makes sense. The moves make sense, you know. And I completely agree with Llewella, or young Llewella, when you saw From Russia with Love. This is, I feel, the only time in Connery's tenure when he seems truly vulnerable. I mean, okay, you could say Goldfinger with a laser beam and, you know, no, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die. But I don't know. Robert Shaw is, as Grant, is scarier to me than a laser beam.
I agree. And the fact it's set on a train compartment, you know, very constrained. It's not like it's on an oil rig or something with lots of spaces to hide and jump. I mean, that's so constrained. And Llewella, I'm glad you brought up, you know, the juxtaposition of that scene versus the Roger Moore, Jaws, Richard Keel scene, which, you know, as a kid, that actually terrified me more. As an adult, when I watched it the other day, I just found it even more chilling than I remember. The scene with, you know, when he says, you know, I'm going to have you crawl over and kiss my foot and it's going to be a slow death. And as a kid, you don't really get all of that, right? You get the kind of supervillain. But as an adult, you think this is really chilling. And also, you know, what a sick individual. He's not just going to put one on the back of his head, KGB style. He's going to make Bond really pay and suffer. So what do you think, Eric?
So I was going to say, I think one of the interesting things in the casting of the film that works is that Robert Shaw feels like such a mirror of Connery. You know, you have that the famous story of Connery's casting where they don't think he's right for the part, and then they watch him, you know, leaving, and he walks like a panther, and you get that same sort of sense from Shaw in terms of his physicality, except that, you know, he's this tow-headed blonde, sort of this inversion of Bond there. But I think that one of the things that gives us that sense of tension and that feeling of him as a villain, because there's not really much to him in general. Like he's sort of a cipher of a character, but we've been seeing Bond through his eyes for so long as the movie's gone on, right? So that we have this perspective where our perspective is often, and Llewella, you write about this in terms of like Mulvey and the Gays in your excellent book on From Russia with Love, but we've been put in Grant's place to see all of the prep that he's done, right? To see how he's sort of stalking. We see the places in which he steps in to save Bond so that, you know, he keeps him around as his own prey there. And all of our knowledge of him as sort of this, he's almost like they've built him to be a Terminator, right? He's got one purpose, and it is stalking and killing Bond. And it all comes to a head in that train compartment where it really just does come down to the strength of the two men against each other. And it feels, like you said, like such an even match between the two of them, because we've seen that mirror set up until that point.
I think it's also important to mention here that Robert Shaw was considered to be James Bond before Dr. No was, released, produced. So both Broccoli and Saltzman viewed The Valiant, which Robert Shaw was in, and United Artists had sent them that film to watch. But they then complained to United Artists to say, well, he's in a uniform and we can't really see him as Bond. Now, it never really went anywhere, but that is fascinating, this idea that they didn't cast him as Bond, but they cast him completely correctly as the next henchman in From Russia with Love, because I do think Robert Shaw is ultimately, like you say, Eric, and you say, Michael, the best henchman I've ever seen in a Bond film. I don't think anyone surpasses them, because you've got this wonderful physicality between them, this wonderful competition. You've got an Irish and a Scottish actor that both know each other very well within the context of British cinema, and they really do. They get on very well, but there's this competitiveness between them, and I think they bring that on screen, and I just think it's really amazing acting from both of them. I don't think anyone's ever surpassed that. I think, Lottie Lenya is great, of course, but there's a different dynamic going on there with her and Connery, understandably, because they have a different relationship. But I think him and Robert Shaw in particular, there's something very special, and I don't think any Bond has ever managed that since, to have that relationship. I think the closest one might be Timothy Dalton with Robert Darby, because they work very closely together, but even then it's not quite the same. It's not the same relationship.
How do we think Connery's evolved from Dr. No to From Russia with Love? What differences do you see?
I think he seems much more confident in From Russia with Love. He's much smoother. I mean, in Dr. No, he snaps at people and he sort of yells a bit, I think. And to me, the key scene is when he goes to the Russian consulate to take the lecture. And, he asks if the clock is right. They're like, Russian clocks are always right. And then the bomb goes off and Connery's just like, it's another day on the job. All hell is breaking loose and he is cool and calm. So I feel like he's getting, personally, I feel like this is his best performance as Bond, because by the time we get to Goldfinger, it's a little bit like he's in on the joke. And by Thunderball and You Only Live Twice, well, You Only Live Twice, it feels like he's checked out. But Thunderball, he's definitely in on the joke.
I think I would agree with Michael that Dr. No is a much darker performance as Bond. You think about the scene where he shoots someone in the back in that film, and we only see a little bit of that come out when he's confronting Tatiana on the train about what the real plot is and where her loyalties lie here. I think part of what allows him to be softer in this film too is a really strong script that gives him that great relationship with Karen Bay. And that sort of jocular friendship that the two of them have allows us to see a sort of softer side of Bond than just the sort of mercenary that's going in to do the mission. And so we see through that relationship, we see a couple of scenes where Bond is put on his back foot a little bit, where he's jokes around, where he has some of his intentions questioned, and sort of little joking ways that can only happen between, long-standing friends there. And I think that inclusion of the Karen Bay character becomes really important, not just for From Russia with Love, but for the whole evolution of Bond as a character.
So it's interesting that we have covered a lot of the villains in this. Do we think, because also there's Kronstein as well, and do we feel that this is, one of the elite Bond movies when it comes to believable villains?
Yeah, I definitely think this is probably the best array of villains, and Kronstein is terrific. And I don't know how you guys feel, but I feel that the Blofeld that we don't see, played by Anthony Dawson, I'm not sure who did the voice, is the best version of Blofeld. He's quite threatening. A lot of Lenya, that scene when before Kronstein is kicked near the end, a lot of Lenya is, believably sweating, and scared in front of this Blofeld, whereas when we finally see his face, You Only Live Twice, it's a bit of a letdown.
In talking about Kronstein, we should talk about the fact that it's something like almost 20 minutes before we get to actually see James Bond in this film, and the early act of the film is setting up all of these individuals who are part of this big machination against him there. And I love the scene with Vladek Sheybal, I think, is where he's in this obviously incredibly important chess match, right? And there's so much, again, that this movie does with just implications of things. When he gets the drink with the coaster underneath that tells him he's been summoned, right? We know that despite it seeming like he's a grand chess master in like one of the largest tournaments, I know nothing about chess, but that this absolutely takes precedence, that he has to go right away, and that he immediately makes the move to end the chess match so that he can leave right away. And that teaches us, one, about his character, two, about the nature of Spectre as an organization, and three, it sort of sets up this really interesting metaphor of chess and knowing the moves of the other side in advance and plotting against those moves that sort of underlies the rest of the plot there. But I just want to say that Vladek Sheybal, if we were to make like a Hall of Fame for like spy movie and television actors, he would be like first ballot for me, because he's in this, he's in Casino Royale, he's in $1 Billion Brain. Later on in his career, he's in Scorpio, he's in Jigsaw Man on television, he's in Smiley's People, he was in an episode of Danger Man, he was in The Saint, he was in The Baron, he was even in, he wasn't in the original Avengers, which I feel like they missed out on there, but he was in the new Avengers later. And I feel like when I think of, those sorts of characters in spy movies, he's the first face that sort of comes to mind there.
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I love that scene towards the, I know we're jumping ahead, where is Blofeld going to kill Kleb or Kronstein for the failure of the mission? And that's very suspenseful, because if you look at Kleb's face, she's sweating profusely, and Kronstein looks a little arrogant, thinking it's not going to be me because the plan's perfect. I didn't pick the personnel, and I really enjoyed that scene, that suspense that you didn't know who was going to be taken out. How was that for the rest of you?
Well, I was just going to say real quickly, it's notable that when Kronstein gets the note at the chess match, by now Spectre has a logo, so they've branded. And of course, Blofeld has the ring, so they have merch. So they're really evolving as an organization. I'm sorry, Llewella, go ahead.
No, you're totally right. Merchandise is really important, and it grows, of course, with Russia. From Dr. No, and it becomes even more important with Goldfinger. But actually, also the other thing that's interesting, and it relates to perhaps more recent news, is Russia is actually very playful in certain ways. So, of course, when you see the credits of From Russia with Love, Blofeld is a question mark. It doesn't say Anthony Dawson, even though he's in the call sheets for the film, and that's exactly who is playing Blofeld. The point is in the credits, it's question mark for Blofeld. So that Eon Productions at this time are still being very playful with their, how they cast people and how they then represent that casting at the end of the film. And I've always thought that's really quite fun with Russia. And they've never quite done it since, have they? They've never done that with, Blofeld or anyone else. So, yeah, I really like that at the end of Russia, that you've got this big question mark as to who he is.
Yeah, it's a very clever conceit that also sort of allows them to kick the concept of Blofeld down the line. Another movie, it's similar thing happens in Thunderball, and it's not until, as Michael said, You Only Live Twice, when we see a big reveal of that figure, but. The initial placement of the camera behind him as they come in, gives us that air of mystery, the limiting of the hands to the petting of the white cat, but also that really, really creepy and, probably problematic, would not pass the ASPCA today, the scene with the fighting fish that he establishes the sort of metaphor for Spectre is this third power that watches the other two fish fight until one is too weak to fight back. The survivor is too weak to fight back, and then Spectre comes in and destroys them. And then the scene of him feeding the pulling the fish, the carcass out and feeding it to the cat. There's just such an air of menace in everything that he does here. The boat, sort of the isolation that he has, this sort of mobile base from which he works. There's a little character note that I really love when they're bringing Kronstein aboard the boat for the first time, and he stops at the door, and the lower henchmen with machine guns are around him, and he sort of turns to one and looks down at the gun and hesitates for a moment, because he's sort of the brain against the strength, and those are the sort of two aspects of the organization that are represented there. But everything, the set of the inside of that boat, there's this great, and speaking of watching it recently, I'd never noticed this until I watched last year, and I've seen From Russia with Love probably more times than the other Bond film at this point, but there is a funky painting on the wall of Blofeld's lair there that is this weird occult symbol. If you look behind Kronstein, it's off to the right of the screen, that I don't know if I'd never been able to see it in lower resolution versions of the film before, but I watched it last year on a Blu-ray for the first time, and I was like, what is that? There's this like sort of really weird, sort of evil, supernatural presence even to Blofeld in that moment, all sort of building this menace, and then attaching the question mark to it, is, like you said, is just sort of a playful bit of punctuation on this character that becomes really inherent to the character of Bond, despite only being a villain in, well, now 3 with Spectre, I suppose, like three of the films, but he the plot underlies all of the Connery movies, that he's this sort of unseen menace behind all of this evil that's going on in the world.
And just to add to that, Eric, what I like with Kronstein is you have this chess grandmaster, whatever he is, and it just shows that Spectre has their people in all avenues of life, right? I mean, okay, Rosa Klebb is ex-Soviet. She's defected to Spectre. You kind of anticipate that. But a chess champion, you're not really thinking is going to be one of the Spectre people. What did we think of the opening with Grant killing Bond in the opening moments? How did that work for everybody?
Llewella probably knows more about this than I guess I do. Is it true that Peter Hunt, the editor, sort of created that sequence or moved it to the pre-credits, and thus the pre-title sequences were born? That's what I've read, that he also sort of moved around the way the storytelling goes in the first act, the planning stage as well. Sort of going off topic with your question here, but is that accurate?
I mean, that's not something I've read about in the archives that are related to the United Artists papers or the Rich Maybaum papers. That doesn't mean to say that he didn't, but I've seen evidence to suggest that he did. I mean, what I've got to say about the opening is the suits are absolutely beautiful. It's a beautifully choreographed sequence, which is very much related to how it's kind of cutting out how Fleming begins his novel, but super fast, kind of tracking what we're to expect with From Russia with Love. But yeah, the Peter Hunt thing is interesting. I haven't read about that. I haven't seen any archival evidence to suggest it. It doesn't mean it's not true. It just means that I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that.
Shane, I think there's 2 really interesting things about the opening sequence. The first of which is that we have Sean Connery playing not James Bond there, and it's an interesting performance because we see Connery, and I don't know what to name that character. I love the line later about Spectre using live targets and things, and who are the people who volunteer for this service. But Connery representing a figure as Bond that is really fearful and uncertain from the get-go, who is being stalked and is aware of it, as opposed to Bond throughout the rest of the film, who is being stalked and who is completely unaware of it. The other thing that I'll say is interesting is that there's a concept of James Bond as a secret agent, and I think that this film sort of puts paid to the fact that he is secret at all, right? That he is so well known that Spectre has enough of his appearance that they can make a completely realistic mask to represent his face, and the idea that Tatiana could fall in love with him from just a file photo that they have of him there. That James Bond at this point, even in the second movie, not the second novel, but the second movie, is enough of a known commodity in the world of international espionage that everybody knows what he looks like. We've got pictures, we've got masks, we've got the whole lot.
I mean, I do wonder what it was like for a cinema goer in 1963 to sit there and it's early doors, Bond's killed off, and okay, that's something we've seen in a lot of movies since, but back then that would have been quite novel, wouldn't it?
Yeah, no question. No question. I think they do that in Dr. No as well. I keep wondering how people responded to the gun barrel the first time and those wonderful credits in Dr. No. But another thing you get in this first scene, that pre-title sequence, is how still Grant is. Even when he kills Bond and they come up and they pull the mask off the guy, Robert Shaw shows no emotion whatsoever. It's nothing, which is, again, a part of his power throughout the film.
I agree. And I think that opening also is where you start to fear him because, you can see the way he moves, that he's assassinated, what you think is James Bond, and it's the beginning of the build-up of that character. This is going to be a really tricky enemy for Bond. And as I understand it, Llewella, that scene was actually shot at Pinewood Studios' front lawn, wasn't it?
The opening, yes, it was.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what's wonderful about it as well. But going back to what the audiences would think of the film, they absolutely loved it. They thought it was hilarious. Yeah. And I've actually seen it more recently at the wonderful Prince of Wales cinema that we have just off of Leicester Square. I've seen very young couples go in to see their first Bond film, which happened to be From Russia with Love. And they'll sit there laughing. And I think that's what Bond is all about. It's about seriousness, but also enjoyment of that and such pleasure that they've got. There's a fantastic article in 1963 that's published after the release of From Russia with Love in Amateur Cinematographer, talking about how you should go and see this film, to go and see how Terence Young basically directs it. And this is a great advice for amateur cinematographers on how to make a brilliant film. And this is why I think this film is particularly special beyond other Bond films, because this, after Dr. No and the success of it, which was huge, people go along and they watch the second one. Even the costume designer, Jocelyn Rickards, who's employed on From Russia with Love, she's employed because Harry Saltzman rings her up and he goes, "Oh, would you like to work on that one?" And she goes, "Oh, well, I watched Dr. No, which was fun, but is this one going to be more fun?" And he's like, "Yes." And she comes on board. So, and this is the thing, it's both for cast and crew, but also audiences. It develops on from that last film, which they thought was really jolly good fun. And then this one, they enjoy themselves. And I think that's what people have to remember. People actually laugh at this film too. They had great fun watching it at the time. And what's really wonderful is people still do now. And I think that's fantastic.
Although this is a dark Bond movie, right? You got two women fighting to the death at a gypsy camp. Terrifying, right?
Well, I think
that made me laugh was...
You think that's terrifying, maybe.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, it's... You might find that terrifying. Not everyone does.
Well, no, but what I found terrifying about that is all the men are sat around watching it like it's sport. And you just think, these are two women fighting. For me, I found that quite harrowing. And not what I want Britain's best secret agent to be any part of, quite frankly.
To be fair, he's not
who we are.
He is observing. He is doing what Fleming wants him to do. He is observing. He is behaving himself in another culture. That is arguably a very Fleming-esque sequence.
You are absolutely correct. And he's doing what every spy has to do. He has to use every advantage to get the intel and form allies. I totally get it. But as a viewer, I was very uncomfortable with that whole scene. How about you, Eric and Michael?
Martin Bezic. Sorry, I think she's fabulous.
Oh, I'm not commenting on their acting at all. I just mean that scene for me, I just thought was like, wow, that's especially in 1963.
I think that there are, there's something to the male gaze that Llewella talks about in the book. Again, everybody should read the book. That we see sort of there that we see the fight happen, and then we see all these shots from below, right? And that's part of what makes that scene feel so lurid in terms of the gaze of the men around is that we see them shot in ways that put them in power in the frame. And there's a sort of, there's perhaps a sort of critique that happens with the camera there. But then, you know, we also get the lurid shots that are there of the fight and of the, we want to mention also the belly dance that happens beforehand. I think that there's a level of uncomfortableness that you're supposed to feel there. And I think also a level of discomfort that you're supposed to feel in the earlier scene. We haven't talked about where Tatiana is first being interviewed to see if she is the person that Kleb is going to send forth for this job. That the questions that Kleb asks there are inevitably the sorts of questions that would be asked or considered of a young actress in a casting call for a film at this time, and that we have sort of this implied, we haven't talked about this sort of implied homosexuality or asexuality of the Kleb and Grant characters that is carried over from the Fleming novels here. The ways in which Kleb moves around Tatiana and touches her in the ends of the scenes are meant to evoke that feeling of discomfort in us, at the same time as it's also sort of being presented as a sort of lurid thing for us to gaze upon ourselves.
Yeah, we haven't spoken much about Tatiana and her role in this. Michael, how was she as a Bond girl for you?
You know, when I haven't seen this movie for a while, I always think Daniela Bianchi, oh, she's not that good. But having recently watched it, I think she is pretty charming in this role. I don't think Tatiana is especially well written. You know, she falls in love with Bond very quickly, and there's that scene when, after Karen Bay has been killed, that Bond confronts her, and she kind of goes, "I love you, James, I love you," and it's a little cringy. But she didn't write the script, but I think there's a naturalness to her that I kind of like. And again, having just watched Dr. No, I have to say I think she's a step up from Ursula Andress in the acting department, quite frankly.
How about you, Shirella?
I agree with Michael. And I think by Daniela Bianchi's own admission, you know, she's not really an actress. She got cast in the role. She found it difficult, I think, on set, as in just, you know, not really being an actress, being Italian, kind of getting into it. I think she does well enough, like you say, within the script that she has. I think she's actually a fascinating character, though, because unlike some others, you know, she's the one that actually really seems to like Bond, but he doesn't really seem to like her all that much by the end of it. And that relates back to the novel, of course. But what's fascinating is that, you know, unlike, you know, Ursula Andress coming out the sea and being very iconic and absolutely stunning, you know, Tatiana doesn't have that, nor does she have the kind of stuff you get with Luciano Palazzi and Thunderball having some agency. So it is quite fascinating to watch her character. Her character's there kind of, isn't it, to be the victim. You know, on the train, she gets drugged. You know, interestingly, in an early script form, she actually gets drugged by Bond rather than Meg Grant, which is a fascinating tidbit. And it's there because Bond gets sick of her, so he drugs her instead of Meg Grant. And it doesn't obviously work, so they rightly change that round, so Meg Grant drugs her. But it's, you know, she's there to basically be a bit of an irritant, I think. Beautiful and stunning in every way, but she's there to not quite, like you say, Michael, you know, advanced storyline, which is fascinating for the film compared to the novel, because when you read the novel, you know, Bond ditches her quite early in that. And in an early draft, he ends up, you know, surviving and going out with her on a date, but he doesn't really want to because she's Russian. And so there's that context as well. So, you know, they kind of skip that in the film and make her an easy kind of, you know, target for, okay, she's quite pretty and there's some lesbianism going on between her and Kleb, but that's about it. That's the, you know, the moment in the film. I don't know what you want to say, Eric.
I was going to say, it's interesting too that when they do her dialogue replacement, because it's not her voice in the film, her, you know, her lines are dubbed over, that they do sort of lower her voice. You can see Bianchi later in, there's some great Eurospy films that she's a part of where you can see her performing more as herself with her own voice and accent. But they bring her much further down to the register of, the sort of young Garbo, I think is what Fleming describes her as in the novel. I'm always curious at the end, though, and perhaps it can be explained by some of the things that you've just said, when she's having to make the choice of who to shoot in the final scene in the hotel room, whether it's going to be Bond or Klebb. I always wonder, why is she still considering shooting Bond at that point? Because she should at that point, if Bond has explained the situation to her, she would know that Klebb is not part of SMERSH anymore, or is not Soviet, but is part of SPECTRE. Did he keep that from her? And so she is torn between her loyalty to Russia, or is there something more to that relationship between her and Klebb that we haven't seen off camera? That's a point that I always come down to in the end, where she's sort of doing the gun back and forth between the two of them, and I'm thinking, well, but why? What? Surely you've made your decision at this point.
Yeah, so I agree with you on that. If I may, I want to move on to the cinematography. And how do you feel that contributed to the film's espionage aesthetic? Michael, start with you.
This movie has the spy vibe going for it so much. There's some great scenes that are shot just beautifully. Tatiana's walk to Klebb's apartment in the beginning. There's some lovely, atmospheric sort of places that she goes, but especially the scene in the San Sofia Mosque. I think that's, again, I'll give Llewella's book another plug. I read it this week. It is fantastic. If you like this movie at all, you definitely should read this. And one word that comes up a lot in her book is Hitchcockian. And those scenes especially do kind of feel that they owe a debt to Hitchcock. So yeah, I think cinematography plays a big role. It's a much darker film in subject matter and in cinematography compared to Dr. No, which is like Jamaica, bright.
Are you, Llewella?
Obviously I agree with both Eric and Mike. But I'd also like to mention lighting in this film, which is mostly quite dark in places, but absolutely that train sequence, they get it absolutely spot on, don't they? When the camera is tracking through and the lighting, that blueness, when you watch it, it's absolutely stunning. And the compartment sequence as well, where you're stuck in a compartment with Bond and his adversary, who's equal to him, and that's Rig Grant. The lighting is fabulous. I don't know, obviously people have celebrated it and mentioned it, but yeah, that claustrophobia is just purely down to lighting and backlighting, isn't it? And everything else in between. And I think that's amazing. So, but I'll let Eric come in on that as well.
So I think that, I have a note here that says compare the cinematography of From Russia with Love to Goldfinger, which I think is much more flat. And I think a lot of it has to do with that lighting, that they push the contrasts a lot here. There are really, really rich shadows. I also love the stock of Technicolor that was used for this era of films where everyone has these like sort of rich brown skin tones, no matter what their actual skin tones are. They're sort of centered in these areas, but not really like a completely noir lighting, but in those train sequences, the ways in which I think again about the sequence that we talked about earlier, where Grant is stalking him in the windows behind, the way the light of the windows draws our attention to that character. And we sort of see the scene play out on two levels with Bond and Bay's son, who is, I think that's also a wonderful scene of acting where Bond is breaking the news to Karen Bay's son that his father is dead, and then immediately gets into his gruff, like, but here's what I need from you. You do not have time to grieve, because this is what I need to survive this moment. But we have that drama playing out on the lower half of the screen, and a secondary drama playing out on the top where Grant is sort of following along, and our attention is drawn to that by just very, very clever, like you said, use of lights to draw focal points on the screen. It's just an incredibly thought out movie. And the other thing in The Train is there's so much camera movement. We're restricted in the space that we're in. But as people are moving around, the camera is following them everywhere. Whereas, you know, I went back and watched Goldfinger recently. Camera's much more medium shots most of the time, right? And sticking with characters for a longer time. Young and the cinematography in this film, they're really making every shot active, even when it's just characters talking. That gives a sense of that tension that arises from that place.
It's interesting. I watched this. So a while ago, Apple had a deal on. It was the whole Bond back catalog for $99. And of course, I jumped on it. And so I watched it on the Apple one, which I think is 4K. I'm not a tech expert on this stuff and formats, but it was incredible. It really was a different experience for me. And it was the same thing. I watched The Spy Who Loved Me a couple of weeks ago on that as well. And like you said earlier on, Eric, about the picture behind Blofeld. And, you know, I noticed like how they dress the sets as well, the level of detail. And I really urge people, if you can get hold of the 4K or the latest format, it does elevate the film. And seeing Istanbul, you know, is stunning, you know, the whole wide view of the streets. And for me, what was interesting going to the train carriage, though, and you all movie buffs, you know more about this far more than I do. I'm just a viewer. But the editing of that, I couldn't detect, or it certainly wasn't obvious that there was stunt people taking the place of Connery in that. It was so well edited when you consider how tight they were in that compartment. I thought that was very, very clever.
Yeah, the choreography of that scene is great. The editing, the cinematography, all of those things have to come together so well to tell that story. I think there's even a couple of points where the camera jumps the 180-degree line, which, if you know, film is generally a no-no, but I think adds sort of to the tension of that, that we feel every collision of every punch, right? That the edits don't allow us to sit and spectate almost, that every cut is a representation of the violence that's happening on the screen. That leads it. I think it's my favorite fight across all of the Bond films, because I think as Llewella said earlier, it feels like the stakes are genuine, right? It feels as though this is a real fight between two people who are evenly matched, and at any point it could go either way. And I also there's a sort of brutal cruelness to the way that Bond kills Grant with his own hands, right? That he sort of wraps the watch around him, and the way that they're intertwined there in that moment of death. It's such a grounded fight compared to Bond as it proceeds throughout the rest of the much more formulaic films.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting as well, Eric, that we have the suitcase, the gadget in this, which he uses, but it's not. You know, it's still the body language of Bond to get Grant to open the case. You know, it's not just, here you go, bang. You know, he's got a tempting, which I thought was very, very clever. And I hadn't picked up on that until this most latest viewing. And also Major Boothroyd, Q makes an appearance in this. This is his first appearance of Q. And I kind of like that scene, you know, where they walk through the SPECTRE training camp. And it is like the Bond scenes that are to come with the gadgets that Q has. But this is the enemy, right? It's the opposition doing all of that, showing off their gadgets. I thought that was, obviously they didn't know at the time, but it's funny looking back at it and saying, oh yeah, that they kind of took that for the for Bond and Q to develop later on. Let us move on to the score. How was the score for you, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, it's getting there. It's not quite the big brassy sound of Goldfinger and Thunderball that we get, but it's pretty atmospheric. And it does have the great 007 theme, which is used a couple of times, I think, and is brought back later. But it's kind of an underused theme, but I really quite like the 007 theme. I like the From Russia with Love title, the song.
Yes.
I think it was a good choice to not have the Matt Monro vocal version over the credits. Which, you know, but yeah, I mean, it's getting there. It's a work in progress for John Barry, I think, at this point.
How about for you, Eric?
There's an interesting story about the Monroe vocal, and I can't remember if I read it in John Burlingame's book on the Bond soundtracks or where I've heard this. But Monroe was there, and his wife, the story comes from his wife, they were watching the movie and weren't aware that the vocal was going to not be used during the opening credits. And so the opening happens, and it's the instrumental version, and she is disappointed for him, right? She's recognized they're not using the vocal that he's recorded for this, and she has big feelings for him, and she looks over at him, and he has just turned into like a 12-year-old boy, just invested in the movie and interested in what's going on, and has not noticed at all that, you know, he's not singing on screen because he's just invested as a Bond fan. And she said that when they get to the end and his vocals come in, she realized, oh no, this is the perfect place to use these. But apparently in their conversations after the film, she was trying to sort of fish for him, like, how did you feel about hearing your voice and your song on screen? And all he wanted to talk about was how much he had enjoyed the movie and how much he loved James Bond. So I can't remember where I've heard that story. But.
Sure. So in terms of legacy and impact, where does From Russia with Love stand, first of all, in the Bond universe, and then overall with spy thriller movies for you, Michael?
To me, I think it's one of the best Cold War movies of the 1960s. Even though the main villain's SPECTRE, it still very much feels like a Cold War movie to me, for many reasons. In terms of its legacy in the Bond films, I think it's very highly regarded. Although I will say, your mileage may vary depending on what you come to James Bond for. I have some friends. Many years ago, I did a sort of a marathon of all the Bond movies up to Quantum of Solace over a weekend with some friends. And, one friend was like, From Russia with Love, it's too slow. It doesn't move enough. It doesn't have, and it doesn't. I mean, the first big action set piece really is the fight at the gypsy camp, which is maybe an hour in. So for some people, if your context for Bond is more Roger Moore era, or maybe, even Pierce Brosnan, this may feel a little slow. But to me, it's the one where James Bond actually does some genuine spy stuff. I think it's a really well-directed film, and as I said, I think it has the best villains in the entire series.
How about you, Eric?
So I think it's funny that that your friend said that it was slow, because I think one of the interesting things about the film for me that I was, when we do these recordings, you sort of have to more consciously think about the film and what is it that I'm enjoying about this, and what makes me enjoy it. I almost feel as though sort of the big stunty set pieces of the end, the helicopter chase, which we haven't really talked about, the boat chase, which we haven't really talked about, even though those are the big, brash spectacles on film, after the tension and the fight in the train car, I almost feel as though a lot of the tension in the movie has been released at that point. And as we talked about before, I don't know that there are any stakes to Bond there. I feel like once he's cleared Grant, he's well and free of whatever situation he's going to be put in. And so those huge stunts, those don't land as much for me as the quiet, slow parts of the film, the chess pieces moving around, right? Those metaphorical chess pieces, everyone getting into place, and Bond not knowing. I think, as we talked about earlier, the Hitchcockian nature of this, we want to point out the helicopter chase sequences sort of directly influenced by the plane sequence in North by Northwest, and I think doesn't land as well, no pun intended, as it does in North by Northwest, because it's not sort of guided by the central mystery of the film at that point. But I think the real Hitchcockian aspect of this film is that we know so many things about what's going on that Bond doesn't. And, Hitchcock has that famous quote about, you get so much more mileage about a bomb exploding under a table if you show the audience the bomb and you tell them there's 5 minutes until it explodes, right? We start with all of the villains telling us exactly what the plot is going to be. We know what Bond is in for, and then we have that dramatic irony for the rest of the film that he does not know, right? There's that great scene where the conversation, the dialogue between Grant and Bond leading up to the fight in the train car, where Bond still thinks that Grant is acting on behalf of Smersh. And he has that little bit of realization there oh no, it's Spectre. Up until that point, he's been operating under false pretenses, right? And he sort of knows going into it that he is, because they feel like they're walking into a trap. But up to that point in the film, he's not been aware of who's rigging the trap against him. And I think the fact that we do know, right, the fact that we've seen him so many times through Grant's eyes, that we see all of these things that he's not privy to, gives us a sense of tension that we don't get in a lot of the other Bond films, where Bond is the driving focus. Here, that plot against Bond is the driving focus of the film, and that brings us in on it in a way that I think makes the film really enjoyable, but also really much more thoughtful than a lot of the other Bond movies.
Fantastic. Well, gentlemen, it appears we've lost Llewella. I don't know how we have to cue and Boothroyd. We have to try and bring her back at some point to get her concluding remarks. But thank you very much for walking us through your thoughts on what I think is not just the best, for me, 007 movie, but, right up there in terms of spy movies, full stop. I think, and as your friend said, Michael, maybe a bit slow, but that's what a true spy movie is. When you look at Mission Impossible and the later Bond movies, they're more action movies for me rather than spy thrillers. So I think this has all the ingredients, and I really enjoyed my revisiting. It'd been a few years since I'd watched From Russia with Love, and I watched it the other day, and I was like, wow, this is even better than I remember. And it's rare that I feel that about a movie. So very, very grateful for you both coming on and sharing more with us on Section F. So we've got to come up with some kind of classification of movies for us all. And I was thinking that, our good friend Jason King on the Spybrary community uses Premier Crew, which is elite for him in terms of quality. And I think we need to set that up here, where we have a Premier Crew rating and then maybe a red file for Callan, which was the file he was given when he had to assassinate someone. And maybe they're the movies that we think are not rewatchable and people shouldn't bother with. And we need a middling grade as well. But, where would you put it in terms of Premier Crew, or is it not quite there, Michael?
Definitely Premier Crew. No question. Yeah. I mean, I would say there are 4 or 5 Bond movies that I would regularly going to go back and watch, and this is absolutely one of them. It's probably in my top 3. So, yeah.
What are the other ones that you would rewatch?
On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Casino Royale, the Daniel Craig one, obviously. Yeah. But From Russia with Love is definitely the best Connery Bond, I think, by far. I know many Goldfinger aficionados out there will strongly disagree with this, but I think it is.
And you, Eric?
Yeah, I definitely put it up there as well. It goes back and forth in terms of it being my favorite Bond film between this and On Her Majesty's Secret Service. I think that in terms of Goldfinger, one of the things that makes From Russia with Love so strong is that it's not burdened by the weight of everything that Bond has to become after Goldfinger. Like, there's so many things that sort of formulaically become set in stone, and this film is darker, is more playful. There's a different perspective involved. The mystery is different to it, and so I think that gives it a leg up. And so I think in terms of top Bond films, it's well up there for me, either 1 or 2.
We were curious to know what your concluding remarks were in terms of where you would score From Russia with Love in terms of the whole Bond canon.
Oh, okay. So I would score it, obviously, 10 out of 10. I think if you're going to offer someone who's never seen a Bond film before or since, if you're on Desert Island Discs, it is the film to watch, because it is a beautiful spy thriller. So go ahead and watch it.
Fantastic. Well, let us know in the comments on YouTube or your podcast app what you think about From Russia with Love. We'd love to read your comments, because as Llewella says, in Bond fandom, this is what it's all about. It's discussing what we think of the movies and the books and the whole Bond universe. So thank you for joining Section F on Spybrary today. And also do consider joining our community of over 4,000 fellow spy fans. That's you can find that at spybrary.com/community. So I'm off to have some fish with red wine, and I'll wish you all a very goodbye.